So, welcome. Lots of visitors, lots of returnees. It's good to see all of you. I am not Randy. For those of you that don't know, my name's Eric Helland. I'm one of the elders here. The second thing I'm going to ask is a favor from all of you. If after the shepherd's prayer, I don't say something about a candle, remind me. All right? This is just important because I will forget because, well, I'm preaching. So, let me start off just a quick, what we're doing. We really want our ministry staff here at Sunny Hills to have a chance to just go and be in the Word and be in the Pepperdine lecture series. So sort of the standing agreement is one of us will preach after the Pepperdine lecture series so Randy and the other ministry staff can get a chance to just be there and really be part of that and not need to plan a sermon, which means that you are sitting through my sermon. So I thought I would start off, when Randy asked us to do this, and I really appreciate the person who said yay. When Randy asked me to do this, he helpfully said, you don't have to preach a sermon on Mother's Day, as in on the topic of Mother's Day. He said, look, Easter, for example, people come to church on Easter. They sort of expect there will be an Easter service. They come to church on Christmas. They expect a Christmas sermon. No one comes to Arbor Day expecting an Arbor Day sermon. So, he said, just preach what's on your heart. And I thought, okay, pressure's off. And I kept thinking about Mother's Day. And a week went by, and I talked over the family, and they said, no, you don't have to preach on it. And I kept thinking about Mother's Day. And I kept thinking about Mother's Day. And here's the dilemma about Mother's Day for me. So the dilemma for Mother's Day for me is this. I have a really great mom. And we're very close in many ways. She's not a perfect person, but she is a really good mother. She's 76 years old. She lives in Columbia, Missouri. She's still alive. And I'll call her later today, and we'll have a nice conversation. And I'll send her a card. And the things I said in the card, I actually believe. And it's a pretty good relationship that we have. And in addition to that, I happen to be married to a pretty good mother. And I know I'm somewhat biased in this, but a while back, I passed Mother's Day off to the girls, and they sort of took it over. And gifts show up for Mother's Day, and we go out for dinner, and it's just a nice holiday for us. And so the issue I have is that I know that that's not true for everyone. I know that there are people whose moms were inadequate, that moms that were addicted to drugs or alcohol or wanted friends more than they wanted to be parents. I know that's true. And I know that there are people who feel as if they weren't adequate moms, that they feel as if they didn't live up to the ideals that we're celebrating. So I thought about this and thought, this is tougher than it is for me for a lot of people. Mother's Day is not an easy one. I had a dear sister in this church call me a few years ago and say, I don't quite know what to do on Mother's Day because I wanted to be a mother, but I didn't get the chance. Is this day for me? Connie right now, her mom has Alzheimer's, and it's pretty far gone. Mother's Day's tough when your mom doesn't know who you are anymore. So this is a holiday, I think, for a lot of people. This is hard. Maybe your mother is gone. Maybe she died at an age and, there's a bit of sadness, but you realize that's the normal course. But maybe she died way too soon, and you feel like you sort of missed out. So when we think about a sermon on Mother's Day, what does Mother's Day mean for the kingdom? We have to remember that this holiday that we created about mothers has very different meanings to different people, right? It may not mean the same thing when we talk about mothers. I shared this with my family, and Sophie said, well, actually, Dad, that's not what it's about. Sorry, Soph. Sophie said, Dad, what it's about is honoring women who are mothers because we don't do that very much in our society. And she's right. I mean, for those of you young women who may be mothers someday, here's the sort of the bad news. You're going to face a really tough choice. And the choice is going to be, do you stay home with your child, or if you're financially able to stay home, or maybe you're not and you need to work. Either way, that choice is going to be hard. One way, you're going to take some time out of the labor market, and when you go back, employers will treat it as if you'd done absolutely nothing for the entire time you were taking care of your kids. And if you do have to work or want to work, you're going to be greeted by employers who are going to spend a lot of time pretending that you're not a mother and you don't have special conflicts, and they're not going to be very accommodating. I'm an economist in my day job, so I speak with some authority about statistics, but here's the bad news. If you look at the distribution of work sharing in marriage, if you are a woman who marries the top quartile, the top 25% of husbands sharing duties, that guy's going to do half as much housework and childcare as you do. He's going to watch twice as much TV and spend twice as much time in leisure activities. And that's the good one. It's not going to be easy on you. So I think Sophie's right. Maybe we ought to just take this day to say to mothers, hey, this is a really valuable thing you're doing. And we ought to honor that in general, maybe not in the specifics of our mother, but in general. And I agree with that. Unfortunately, so if that was just an incredibly short sermon. And you might add, we should probably do that the other 364 days of the year too. So I totally agree with you, but I'm going to pass on that one. So I was left with, what do I want to talk about with regard to Mother's Day? What do I want to say with regard to Mother's Day? What's a good sermon about the meaning of motherhood in the kingdom? So what I'm going to do today is go through just 3 points. They're not particularly related, but they were just kind of what I was thinking about when I thought about Mother's Day in the kingdom. I want to start with the importance of motherhood in the Bible. Now, here's the odd contrast. The odd contrast is if you go into Proverbs, you can find all sorts of things you want to put on a Mother's Day card. This is one, when Connie and I were, I think, first dating and talking about getting married, I was not a member of, any church at the time. And we were having a sort of a back and forth, and I said, okay, what's the ideal Christian wife? And Connie pulled out Proverbs 31. The end of Proverbs 31. Now, I have to say, as a totally progressive young man in the 1980s, I thought that was the most sexist thing I'd ever read. I come back as a 48-year-old married for 27 years, and I like it. And maybe that does something about me, but here's what it says. I'm not going to read all of it, just verse 26. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. She watches over the affairs of her household. She does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children arise and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceptive and beauty fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Let her have honor her for all that her hands have done, and let her works be praised at the city gates. Now, I have to say, I kind of like that now because it's saying, this is sort of humble work that doesn't really get enough attention in our society, and we ought to hold it up because it's really, really important. And that would be a really good sermon. We could work our way through Proverbs. Proverbs has the wonderful thing about telling us lots of things we kind of already think are true. Sorry. That's sort of how Proverbs works. And then I sort of, stumbled into the New Testament. And the problem with stumbling into the New Testament is Jesus says some different things. And I got hung up in Luke chapter 14, the passage that Roger read for us. Just to remind you what it says. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned to them and he said, if anyone comes to me who does not hate his father, mother, wife, and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. I don't recommend that for a Mother's Day card. I really don't. Mom, you raised me right. I want to be a disciple. I hate you. Tends to not be the way we sort of want to go with this. And so we're left with this puzzle. Why does Jesus tell us this? Now, I think there's something more going on here. So I want to pose a couple thoughts for you on this before we get going. And thought number one is, one of the problems with approaching the Scripture, and let me be sort of clear about this, one of the problems with approaching Scripture is the words were said to people who hadn't heard them before. Now, let me just pause. That may be totally obvious, but here's why it matters. Think about your families. most of us here, those families were informed by the words of Jesus. So we tend to have this vision like the first century was great and it's kind of been downhill ever since. Like family's good, road to perdition. I think that's wrong in the course of families. Because I think in many ways the first century family was really different than our families. And our families are in many ways better. And here's the reason I say this. In the first century, when you were born, your identity was tied up in your family, for better or ill. That is, you would be, and one way we know this, by the way, this was true in all sorts of cultures, right? In Scandinavia, where sort of my people hail from, it's common to name people son. My original family surname was Eric Mikkelson, Eric, son of Michael. You were the son of somebody. You were part of a family. That sounds great until you realize you didn't really have a choice. That paterfamilias' word was law. We get a glimpse of this in Acts a couple times, right? Where it talks about such and such's whole household being converted. We skip over that part because in our minds, it's like a big Bible study somewhere in the center of the Roman villa where they're all sitting around with their feet in the fountain listening to whatever disciple is preaching, and then they all decide to be baptized, and it kind of reminds us of sort of a big prayer meeting. That's probably not what happened. What probably happened was the paterfamilias had a study, came out, and announced to everyone the next morning they were Christian, without them knowing anything about being Christian. They learned about it when they woke up that morning. Now that's great. All of us can say, well, that's okay, right? They would learn about it. Eventually they would embrace it. But suppose I came home one day to Connie and said, hey, Connie, look, I decided actually we're all going to worship Baal. I know this is a bit of a shock for you, but I thought about it for a while and I've decided that's what we as a family should do. Most of us would suggest that would be a very bad thing, right? And so the problem with this sort of view of authority is that what you get to choose is totally dependent on who your father was. And your father's enforcer was mom, the one sort of right below him in the hierarchy of the household. So one way to interpret what Jesus is saying, I think, is to say, when I say hate your father and mother, what I'm really saying is diminish their importance relative to the kingdom. Diminish their importance relative to the kingdom. Something most of us would, I think, instinctually do, but we instinctually do it because Jesus said it. Because Jesus told us, you are an individual, you make your choice. You have the chance to have a relationship with God through me. You don't have to go through your family. I think the interesting thing about that phrase, hating your father and mother, is to say, look, family's not destiny. Now, why do I think that's still important for us? Because I feel like for a lot of us, there are things about our family we want to change. And the lesson, I think, for us as Christians is you can. The lesson, I think, for us as Christians is Jesus wants a relationship with you. The rest of your family, they have to make that relationship on their own. Right? Now, I could go on this a long time. But I want to change gears a little bit and say, well, if the lesson of motherhood isn't the Proverbs lesson, maybe it's, and here comes a jump, maybe it's about creation. Maybe it's about creation. Maybe the lesson of motherhood is about creation. Now, let me explain. When I was 13, my father's church had a split. Now, as many of you know, I was actually raised in the Methodist church, and so when Churches of Christ split, they literally split. Like one group goes somewhere else and has a church without a kitchen or something, right? They just go away, and they're not there, and nobody talks about them. And those of us who are not raised in the Church of Christ, like, what happened to Phil, right? But Methodist churches don't do that. What happens is they just divide up at coffee hour and glower at each other. So here was the split. The split in the church was, wait for it, what gender pronoun should we use for God? Now, here's the issue. It was divided up, and I'm going to give them names, which are really, really unfair, but, it's my sermon. I'm going to call them the feminists and the traditionalists. So the feminists came to my father and they said, look, Reverend Helen, God's not male. Why do we insist on having a male gender pronoun for God? We would like you to use the female gender pronoun for God because we'd like God to be a she. And the traditionalist, as you might imagine, went, wah! And my father, of course, is pulled in either direction. And the traditionalists say, well, the fatherhood of God. And the feminists say, no, God doesn't have a gender. And my father worked for weeks and weeks, and he preached a lovely sermon on the feminine and masculine qualities of God. It was a really good sermon. I still remember it. It changed nobody's mind. They just harumphed over coffee. And you know what? It's a good sermon. God does have feminine and masculine qualities. But here's the thing. I think both sides got it wrong as I look back as an adult. Because here's the thing. I don't think we use the male pronoun for God because of a patriarchy or because of God's male qualities. I think we use it for a different reason. And here's my logic. The early Christians, the ancient Hebrews, they knew all about male gods. Zeus was a male god. His name in the original Indo-European dialect, and I swear my family's rolling their eyes at me at this moment, was Zu-Pater, Sky Father. That's what Jupiter means, right? It was, Sky Dad. Now, if you think about it, the reason he was a man was because, and this is a little PG-13, so I apologize, because the Greek myths, he does a lot of things guys do. Now, I should pause here and say, Madeline, Sophie, I am so sorry for reading you these myths when you were 5 years old. If you have children and I am allowed to read to them, I will stick to Max and Ruby and I will not read Greek mythology. I promise your mom will enforce this. But the Greek myths are PG-13 for a reason. They want to emphasize Zeus's maleness. That was not the purpose. The early Hebrews and the early Christians were not emphasizing God's maleness. So why the male gender pronoun? Because there's an even older cult. And the older cult is the cult of the Earth Mother. Now, probably the oldest representation we have of a deity is, and I love this name, it's the Venus of Whiffledorf, which is a crazy name. If you look it up, it looks like it was made by a 5-year-old. It's 25,000 years old. And it's basically an image of a pregnant woman. It's the earliest example we have of this Earth Mother cult. What it says is the earliest peoples, when they looked around at creation, they made what seems to me a really obvious leap. The obvious leap was, look, the body you see in front of you, the strangely short legs and the large head, everything, that body was constructed by Nancy Helland in northwest Iowa in the late 1960s. That's where it came from, right? And so if you observed that, if you were a person 25,000 years ago who knew nothing about how this happened, you could be forgiven for saying, oh, I get creation. Creations like that, people weren't here, now people are here, they come from women, there must be a really big woman who created everything else. That's got to be it. And you kind of can forgive them for the leap of logic, right? Because if that's all you know, that doesn't seem that crazy. The problem is it's wrong. Here's the reason it's wrong. The part of me that matters, said the ancient Hebrews, said the early Christians, isn't the part that Nancy Helland created in northwest Iowa. That part is temporary. It's dirt. It will live, it will die in this world. But there's another part of Eric Helland that is older, that's eternal, that was made in the image of God. That part of Eric Helland lives on, and it can have a relationship with God. That part is what's important. I think part of the gender pronoun that the ancient Hebrews chose was not that they were trying to emphasize God's head of some patriarchy or his essential maleness, but they were saying, that's not how creation works. You're more than that. You're more than that. This body is dirt. What matters is the breath. Now, the reason I say that, in some sense, is I think that's kind of hopeful in some sense, right? Because it says we're so much more than the physical being. We're so much more than what was created by our mothers. Well, One last thought. Words, I think, and this is where I'm sort of going to end up with a couple stories, because that's what I do. Words sort of fail us when we describe God's love. We just have a hard time, right? I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. It's very difficult for us when we don't experience an event on a regular basis, right, to come up with words that describe it that other people get. We have to start making analogies. One of the things we know is that a mother's love is fierce. It's really fierce. My favorite encouragement passage, probably bar none, right? Probably bar none, is Isaiah 49, verse 15. In verse 14, it says, "But Zion, the Lord has forsaken me, the Lord has forgotten me." And then in some ways the Lord responds, "Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion for the child as she has born? Though she may forget, I will not forget you." I think the lesson there is, look, maternal love is really fierce. And God's love is even more fierce. So here's my 3 stories. My first story is about my own mother. It took me a really long time to learn to read. I was in 3rd grade. And what happened was I kept falling behind in reading groups. And basically every step of the way, they would lower me a grade level or a reading group. And I had finally hit the bottom about 2nd grade. There just wasn't any lower to go. I still couldn't read. And I was really despondent one day. And I came home and said to my mother, I don't know what to do. I don't know why I can't learn to read. I don't know why I can't figure this out. And my mother said to me, and I vividly remember this, I'm going to do whatever it takes to fix this. I will do whatever you need. And I utterly believed her because I knew in that moment that my mother loved me more than anything else in the world. Now, what did she do? She quit her job. She stayed home for a year. She got me back on track. She figured it out. And things turned out okay. But I say that because that was my earliest experience of how fierce a mother's love is. Second story, this one I'm going to embarrass someone, so bear with me. I have this mental image of Dwayne Beck in the mid-1970s. The mental image is that Dwayne is in a really cool red unmarked police cruiser. He's wearing an outstanding earth tone suit with an appropriately wide tie. His hat is perched jauntily on his head as he cruises the mean streets of Los Angeles. Detective Beck and his partner driving around. Now, here's the problem. At 1978, I was 10 years old. I was living in Columbia, Missouri. I'd never been to Los Angeles. That's actually Starsky or Hutch. I'm not actually sure. But the reason I say this is, and this I mean in all seriousness, Dwayne's a tough guy. Dwayne did a tough job for a long time as a police officer and as a detective. And I'm certain that Dwayne saw stuff most of us don't want to think about, let alone see. So bear that in mind when I tell you this next story. So I was having a rough time a couple of years ago. Why is kind of not important. And I was at a gathering and just sort of had it. I needed to leave. And I walked out and Dwayne followed me out. He saw something was wrong. And he said to me, "Are you okay?" And you know how you answer that question is always, "Oh yeah, I'm fine," and you just head for the car. And I didn't. I told Dwayne what was wrong. And Dwayne said to me, "If there's anything I can do to help, let me know and I'll do it." Now, that's what we all say, and we all know the expression on the person's face that says it, which is like, "Yeah, I don't really mean that. I'm leaving now, but if there's anything I can do, you just let me." But that wasn't the expression on Dwayne's face. The expression on Dwayne's face was the expression on my mother's face. It was the same expression, which was, "I will do whatever I can to make this better for you." It meant a lot. Last story. This one's controversial, so remember you like me. This was relayed to me by a woman about a church in the mid to early 80s in the Midwest. Now, here's the story, and this is a little PG-13, but bear with me. The story is that in the early 1980s, this was the height of the moral majority, the culture wars going, and what happened was that churches decided that the way to deal with teenage sexuality was to never talk about it, ever. Just pretend it's not happening. And then, once a year, have a purity talk. That was the theory. Now, whether you think that's the right strategy or not, I'm telling you it didn't work particularly well for a lot of these churches. And so what happened was teenagers got pregnant. So the story as it was relayed to me was a woman, and I actually don't know her name, but I'm going to call her Mrs. Walker. Mrs. Walker was an elder's wife in this church in the early 80s, and she was given the task of doing the purity talk, the talk where she was supposed to go to the young women in the youth group and tell them about why they shouldn't have sex till they were married. And it was sort of an important one because, as I said, things had not been going well in this church. Someone had gotten pregnant. And so I'm going to fill in some details that I don't know, because this was relayed to me secondhand by one of the young women now, when this was told to me in middle age. So she didn't give me all the details. But think about an elder's wife in 1982 in a Church of Christ in the Midwest. I think I've got a pretty good picture of what she was like. Presumably, she was a woman who met her husband at a Christian university. She was probably raised in the Church of Christ. She probably, at some point when they got married, he became a deacon. They had children. They were active in the church. And then at some point, when their children were grown and maybe married and having their own children, he became an elder, and she became an elder's wife. And probably that honor was deserved by virtue of the way they had contributed to the church and been part of it. But, and here's the important point, I imagine, whether she would admit this or not, she was very proud of that fact. It's a real honor to have a group of people who care about something as much as a church say, we want you to lead it. So Mrs. Walker gets tasked with the purity talk, and she's supposed to go in and do the version of Scared Straight, where she tells everybody how horrible it is to have sex before you're married. And I'm guessing all the young women in that church at the time were going, here we go, another old woman talking about sex. We'll sit and listen. What could be worse? So Mrs. Walker comes in, and she shuts the door, as this was relayed to me, and she says, I'm supposed to give you a very particular talk, but I'm going to do something very different. I'm first going to tell you that if you do have sex before you're married and you get pregnant, you don't have very many good options. One option is you can keep the baby. But I'm telling you that that young man that's telling you he'll be with you forever and loves you, he won't be. Because he'll be able to go have fun and be a college student and not be a father, and you won't. You will still have that child. Or you can give that child up for adoption, and you will spend your life wondering whether or not you made the right decision and whether that kid's okay. Or you can have an abortion and spend the rest of your life wondering whether you did something truly horrible. Those are your three options, and none of them are good. But then, Mrs. Walker, pseudonymously named, said, I know some of you won't listen, so I'm going to sit down and explain to you how to use birth control. We're going to go through how to use birth control to make sure that if you do make that choice, you don't get pregnant and you don't have to face this. Now, you may think that Mrs. Walker either violated the trust of that congregation and did something terrible, or she's one of the more courageous women you've ever heard about, but that's actually not my point. My point is that woman had everything to lose at that moment. Everything. Because think about a church in 1982. If one of those young women had gone home to their family and said, hey, you know what Mrs. Walker did? She explained to us how to use birth control. Mrs. Walker not only would not have been an elder's wife, she wouldn't have been allowed in the doors of the church. Period. What Mrs. Walker did was say, I don't agree with the choices some of you are going to make, but I love you so ferociously that I'm going to risk everything I care about in this church to make sure that you know what you're doing. Now, my point on this, again, is a simple one. Dwayne Beck has lots of reasons, I would guess, to not think very highly of humanity, given what he chose to do for a career. And yet he's one of the most loving guys I've ever met. Mrs. Walker decided to risk everything, and I could come up with 20 other stories like this about people I'm looking at right now. I think the reason people do that, love other people with that ferocious love, is because they know that God loves them with that ferocious love. If you think about John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that we don't have to perish from the earth. That's a maternal love, folks. That's a maternal love. I will sacrifice everything for you. For you. I love you that much. I don't think we have another analogy for that other than maternal love. I just don't think we do. Most of us experience that for the first time from our mothers. So this is where I want to leave you with. I hope this Mother's Day that you have someone that you call mom that loved you fiercely. And I hope you reach out to her and tell her how much that meant to you. I hope that someone has loved you that fiercely. I hope if you are a mother that you feel that you loved your children that ferociously. I hope someone in this fellowship or in the world showed you that ferocious love. But mostly what I want you to take from Mother's Day today is that God loves you with that ferocious, ferocious love of a mother for her child. That's what I want you to take from me. Thank you.